Good evening, dear friends. On behalf of the Vivekananda Vedanta Society of Chicago, it's a delight to welcome Dr. Marcia Hermansen as our guest speaker today at the Home of Harmony. Dr. Hermansen is a professor in the Theology department at Loyola University, Chicago, where she teaches courses in Islamic studies and the academic study of religion. Dr. Hermansen has published numerous academic articles in the fields of Islamic thought, Sufism, Islam and Muslims in South Asia, Muslims in America, and women and gender in Islam. Her authored and co-edited books include Sufism in Western Contexts, Varieties of American Sufism, Muslima Theology, as well as translations from the work of Shah Wali Allah of Delhi, a prominent 18th century Sufi. Here at the Home of Harmony, we have had discussions on many religions so far, but today, for the first time, we'll be learning about Sufism from Professor Hermansen. She'll be presenting the topic, Encountering Sufi Spirituality from RABI'A and RUMI to the New Age. There will be time for Q&A, so please have your questions ready. And on that note, please join me in welcoming Professor Hermansen with a round of applause.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me well, and I hope that we can have a very pleasant time together for this lecture. This is partly, this is, of course, a new audience for me. And by the way, I would like to express my gratitude to the Vivekananda Vedanta Society for giving me the honor of allowing me to present in your August company. So as I was mentioning, it's a new audience, and I gather that it is an audience that is resonant with spiritual themes and spiritual seeking. And I am going to be, perhaps in this lecture, a little bit academic and historical in the overview, but I also want to at least invoke or touch on some spiritual themes in the course of the presentation. I'll need to move a little bit quickly because I have quite a few slides, but I also welcome if, as I'm going along, if anything like grabs you that you really want me to expound on it a little bit more, you have a question, it's informal enough that I don't mind taking questions throughout. Otherwise, I'll try to, in fact, I'll take off my watch here and keep an eye on the watch so that we have some time at the end. So please do keep some questions as we're going on. So, by the way, how many of you are familiar with Sufism? Or you've got some familiarity with Sufism? So we've got a pretty good critical mass who know what we're talking about. So I won't be starting from here. Let me go here. Is this turned on now? There we go. Oops, it actually went a slide further than I thought. I'm not quite sure why that happened. I think it's my fault. So I'm going to be starting out tonight. Sufism is Islamic mysticism, and I gave it this title. RABI'A of Basra and RUMI are two famous Sufis, but I also want to bring it home at the final part of the lecture to Sufism in the West, and that's why I took the title New Age. And I'm hoping that you'll see some nice synchronism, resonance with some of the themes and missions of the Vivekananda Vedanta Society in the Sufism's embrace, especially in the recent times in the West, embrace of all traditions as paths to the to the truth. So let me start out. The term Sufi, actually in Arabic and some of the other Islamic languages, the term is used, tasawwuf. This term is not found in the Quran, the Islamic holy book that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, but it emerges in the early centuries. So let's say the time of the Prophet Muhammad was 570 to 632 CE, or Common Era. So let's say in about the 800s, one starts finding the term Sufi, tasawwuf, and it's not quite clear where this term comes from. So as I have on the slide, some say it might have come from the word wool, because the early ascetics in that part of the world, even Christian monks, might have been wearing woolen garments. We don't know that. Then there was a group of early Muslims called the people of the bench, the Ahl Sufa. Could it come from that? And some even said, oh no, it comes from the Greek term for wisdom, Sophia. But so this mysterious word Sufi, and of course in English it's made into an ism, Sufism. Now, not all Muslims today, something that I'll say quite quickly is that Sufism, of course, Sufism is Islamic mysticism, and I'm sure that everybody in this audience is comfortable with the term mysticism. But when I present it to my students, often we're not quite sure what that is. Something occulty, something mysterious. It sounds like mysticism, mystery. So mysticism I'm going to define as the passionate search, quest for an experience of the ultimate. That ultimate might be the truth. That ultimate might be understood as a divine being. But mysticism is a search for that ultimate experience in this life. And usually the term mysticism we find used in the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And in the case of Judaism and Christianity, mysticism is definitely there, but it's something that is kind of done by the few, right? The select. But I would say I'd like to make the point that in the course of the Islamic tradition, tasawwuf, or Sufism, had really been embraced by vast numbers of people and had a profound effect on the cultures, literature, art, music produced in Muslim societies. And even, I know it's hard to, get statistics on this kind of thing, but apparently it's estimated that in the Ottoman Empire around the turn of the 20th century, about 90% of Muslims there had some kind of affinity to Sufism. And of course, as in all traditions, you have what anthropologists refer to as, high tradition or great tradition, that of the scholars, right? That of the authorities. And then you have popular religion, right? Folk religion, the little tradition. And that's where you get 90% of the population. In other words, they went to Sufi shrines, they appreciated Sufi poetry. They may not have been following an initiatory path. That was for the few. But the Muslim cultures were infused with Sufism. And of course, here there's a connection to the rich cultures of South Asia. And in South Asia, the Muslim populations, even until quite recently, you could probably say the default of 90% of the South Asian Muslims was Sufism. Again, at the popular level, shrine visitation, liking Sufi poetry, listening to Sufi music, and then there were the, shall we say, initiates. But today, the Sufism has encountered more recently, over the 20th century and now into our 21st century, quite a few challenges. And in fact, if you ask a Muslim, of course, there's over 1 billion Muslims in the world, and they come from many, many diverse countries. But many Muslims, if you ask them, what do you think of Sufism? Well, you get a variety of answers. I think among my Muslim students, I might say, what do you think of Sufism? What's that? That might be one answer. Another answer might be, that's not Islam. So there's been a kind of critique of Sufism. So that's why I have the question on the slide, is Sufism Islamic? We have an imaginary debate. Why or why not? So for, let's say, I'm still learning your control here. For the Sufism being Islamic, so it's like the imaginary debate, right? The pros and the cons. So evidence, the word is not found in the Quran. So those who are kind of anti-Sufi would use that argument. Well, it's not found in the Quran. But most of the terms about Islamic law, like Sharia or the 4 schools of law, that is also not found in the Quran, right? So that may not be the criterion for saying something's not Islamic. If you want to say, well, the word Sufi is not in the Quran, but there are so many mystical verses, like God is closer to you than your jugular vein, right? That's very immanentist. Or the signs of God are on the horizons and in yourself, right? That's highly mystical. Know yourself, know God. And so many other mystical verses are there in the Quran. And then, of course, the criterion in the Islamic tradition for what is Islamic is the Quran. And then the Sunnah, the practice and tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. So the Prophet Muhammad received revelations. He had spiritual experiences. He used to go and do retreats in a cave. He went on what is called the night journey, a kind of ascension through the 7 heavens where he came face to face, or he encountered, or he was immersed in the divine. So one can see that there's quite a strong, mystical tradition in Islam. In fact, sorry, when I say that, I'm reminded of the point that I kind of lost early on when I was talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Mysticism is often not the default that one thinks of in the Abrahamic traditions. But in the Islamic tradition, as I was mentioning, it's had so much influence. One may say that Islam, from a mystical point of view, has a strong monistic orientation. In other words, all is one. Even the Shahada, there is no God but God. It's like there is only God. So you have both a kind of monism, all is one, in the Islamic tradition, along with dualism. So qualified non-dualism leaves a lot of space for mysticism in Islam, whereas in the other Abrahamic traditions, the monism is there, but it's kind of the path of the few, if I can put it that way. Now let's look at the other side, the proponents that Sufism is not Islamic. So the criticisms of Islam, I mentioned that in the 20th and 21st century, Sufism has come under assault, attack, verbally, sometimes even physically, by those who do not appreciate it. It's sometimes said that it is an innovation. It is not part of the original tradition. And the basis for that is that Islam is a religion that spread globally, very widely. to Africa, to Southeast Asia, to South Asia. And wherever it spread, it took on many of the local characteristics, many of the local tastes, and of course that allowed it to be successfully integrated in these cultures. And Sufis were often kind of in the front of that process of bringing Islam to the local cultures. And Sufis often, for example, the case of India, the Qawwali music of the Sufis. So some Muslims would say music is not part of the Islamic tradition. But in the case of Sufi music in South Asia, the music becomes a vehicle for communicating the poetry and the mystical insights. So, of course, those who reject music will say, well, that's opening the door to things that were not originally part. There's also a term in the Islamic tradition, an Arabic term, shirk, which means to associate or conflate things that are not God with God. We may learn, I may mention in this tradition, that the great Sufis are considered to be awliya. Awliya can mean friends of God, close to God, and so there is a great respect. Almost, we may say, if we get academic, we would say, well, if you say saint, it's not quite the same as a Christian saint, but kind of in a nutshell, it gives that idea. So for those who really want to say, no compromising of the divine powers, you are constructing these deeply spiritual Sufis as having powers that no human should have. So this would be a criticism that it opens the door to shirk. Now, I believe you received a handout, and I hope you will see it as helpful and not too overwhelming. It is kind of both a chronological, so there's like a time scale and a geographical across the horizontal axis of the spread of Sufism, and then the vertical axis. So this is a map, the spread of Sufism. But of course, this does not take in, for example, Africa and Southeast Asia. Whoops, still getting this clicker right. Yeah, so this is the chart. Don't worry about it too much. You can take it home and have a look at it. But I have included, I think I bolded it. I'm going to mention a little bit more about RABI'A of Basra, about Jalaluddin Rumi, and then finally, closer to today, the Sufism comes to the West. So I say this is like a geological chart, right? There's different layers in the development of Sufism. Sufis believe that the Prophet Muhammad and his cousin Ali, that they were the first Sufis. And then it gets passed down, this deep mystical knowledge, as an inner tradition from one to another throughout the centuries. One takes initiation to become a Sufi. But the geological layers are that at the very early period, this Sufism began as almost a pietistic fear of God, trembling. You know, the Quran has many intimations. Judgment Day is coming soon. You must shape up. So that mood of piety and asceticism, a simple life. So the model of the Prophet himself was simplicity. He mended his own clothes. He didn't, eat a lot. So there's a later Sufi saying, eat less, sleep less, meet people less. So that kind of ascetic mood, simple mood, it doesn't go away in Sufism. That still can be a part of it, but that's kind of where it starts. And then it becomes, kind of blossoms into the love of God for the sake of the divine. So, Islam is a very legalistic tradition, right? This action is obligatory. This action is forbidden. and you sort of, get points on the way to heaven from doing the good actions, and then you don't want to do the forbidden actions. So we could say it's kind of an instrumental view of things. But this mood of the love of God in Sufism, the Sufi who epitomizes this is a female. So I wanted to start with RABI'A of Basra, a female Sufi, and there's she's kind of a cultural hero or an important figure in the Sufi tradition and in the Islamic tradition. So there's a hagiography around RABI'A, hagiography like the lives of the saints. And there's, slightly different versions. But basically the gist of it is she was a servant or a slave girl. She was very pious, very devoted in her meditations and prayers. And one night her owner or master came downstairs and saw this young girl in the corner fervently praying, and he saw a light suspended above her head, and so he realized that she had a high spiritual state. So he gave her her independence and built a little hut for her outside of the city, and she spent the rest of it, and she was celibate. She never married. Her spiritual status was considered to be very high. So perhaps a number of those things might work against stereotypes, right, of the Islamic. She's a female, she doesn't get married, she's independent, and she's highly spiritually developed, and her authority is recognized. So there's a famous saying of RABI'A, I don't know if you've heard it, that she used to say, "Oh God, if I worship you out of fear of going to hell, then send me to hell. Oh God, if I worship you because I want to go to paradise, may I never enter there." And of course, that's mystical paradox, right? Mystical paradox. And the paradox is, of course, cutting against this kind of instrumental view of why one performs devotions. One is drawn, one loves the divine. So this mood pervades Sufism from then up until the present, and it even can become ecstatic, right? This love allows the ego to be transcendent and a merger into the one to occur. And the Sufis refer to this as fana, right? Annihilation in the divine, annihilation in the divine. So there's love, and I named some other Sufis. I can't say much about them due to lack of time tonight, but one is the famous at the bottom. I've listed his name, Al-Hallaj. And Al-Hallaj was one of very rarely in the Islamic tradition do you have the idea of something like heresy. It's a person's belief and faith is their own. It's really more a religion of actions and conformity to these actions. But it's said that Al-Hallaj was an intoxicated Sufi who cried out in that state repeatedly, Ana al-Haq, which means I am the truth, and it's sort of a truth with a capital T. So I am God. I am God. And this was considered to be blasphemous, and he didn't desist. So after that, Sufism took, up to that point, so this was 922, up to that point, Sufism had been a more individual pursuit of the truth on the part of these deeply mystical beings. And after that point, Sufism began to be a more organized and institutionalized path, and so we call that the time, whoops, wait a minute, what happened here? Okay, I don't have the slide, but let me just tell you, that became the time of what we would call, it's on the sheet, the Sufi theorists. So you have this big production in the 1000s of manuals, like a how to be how to be a Sufi and proper comportment. And Sufism begins to have adab, a proper behavior on the path. There's Sufi psychology. There's the word nafs. It can mean soul or ego. And so Sufism is mapped out as a path that cultivates different levels of the being and different virtues, as you have in many other mystical traditions. So that's another whole topic, Sufi psychology. And it's kind of after, or the latter part of this time of the theorists. So it's like the Sufis drew, of course, the high tradition, the intellectual Sufis of that time, they were drawing on Greek philosophy and emanation theory, how to understand the movement from the divine one into the multiplicity of the world. And that takes us to the state of the Sufi philosophers and poets. And that's where I can get to speak about Rumi, the second figure in my title. And Rumi actually was born in Central Asia, probably like Uzbekistan. And his family fled first to Syria. They were fleeing the Mongols under Hulagu, the grandson of Genghis Khan. And Rumi, his name means, Rum in Arabic is like Rome. That's what the Arabs called the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. So Rumi ended up in Turkey, which was at that point, a mixed society, Christian, Muslim, in that part of central Turkey in Konya. And Rumi was a learned scholar who had 300 students who hung on his every word. And again, this is a hagiographical story of Rumi, that one day he was walking back from his lecture and he was carrying maybe his lecture notes and some book he had written. And suddenly he was accosted in the street by a wild dervish, a Sufi, who grabbed all of Rumi's materials, his books and writings, and threw them into a nearby well. At which point Rumi exclaimed, my knowledge, you've taken it away, you've destroyed it. And the wild dervish, who is called Shams, said, well, if your knowledge could be taken away so easily, what good is it? And then Rumi had an aha experience, and he became a disciple of Shams, and they were inseparable. But Rumi's students were not like the students of today. They became very jealous that their teacher was all the time in the company of this dervish, so they hatched a nefarious plot to stab him with their reed pens when he came out into the garden. But apparently when Shams came out into the garden, then the students, rushed him. He disappeared, never to return. And so Rumi, in destitution at the loss of his soulmate, used to hang onto a pillar in his Sufi lodge and walk around in a trance, and in that trance he would recite a beautiful Persian poetry, reams of it, books of this poetry, which became compiled in a book called the Masnavi, which is one of the classics of Sufism and one of the poetic classics in the Persian language, such that every Iranian or Persian-speaking child probably memorizes some of the Masnavi. Have any of you ever heard of the Masnavi before? You've heard of it, Nusra? Yeah, some of. Anyway, I want to tell you a poem. So it's like these nested stories, very rich. Some of them are religious stories of the prophets. Some of them are parables about animals. Some of them are very human. But there's this very moving poem that opens the Masnavi, And I'm going to paraphrase it in English for you and just have you think about the meaning for a moment. Is that okay? In the class, I have my students figure out what is this poem about, so you can see if you can figure out what it's about. It goes like this. Listen to the sound of the flute as it is lamenting, because it has been torn from its home, the reed bed. And the sound of the flute as it is crying is like the moan that is issuing from the heart of every man and woman. Everyone who is far from their origin longs to return. So the key to the poem is the flute, right? What is the flute? The flute is us. So here we see, this is what I would call the humanistic turn in Sufism. Remember I said the Sufi philosophy was how do you get from the one into the many? So at this period in Sufism, you have the idea that we are mirrors reflecting the divine. Now, of course, the signs of God are within. So the reed flute, the Quran says that God breathed God's spirit into Adam. So we humans are like the divine breath, the divine spirit is playing through us, and we are in pain because we are separated, we have forgotten our origin, which is bliss, the one. But it is not meaningless, this, playing through us. It is sad, it is evocative, but it is full of beauty and meaning, right? So that's the human condition, and we are returning. Indeed, we are from God, and to God we return. That's Quranic. So there's, of course, an Islamic framework, but there is a mystical, humanistic, Sufi understanding, and RUMI especially embodies that. And perhaps some of you have read, or you'll get interested, very well-known translations of RUMI by an American poet called Coleman Barks. So there's a book called The Essential RUMI, and which has his poem. So if you go to Turkey, you'll see these postcards everywhere. Of course, no one knows what Rumi looked like, but he's a kind of culture hero. So he's developed his own iconography of what he looks like, and he founded, some of you may have heard of the whirling dervishes. So over time, his followers engage in this ritual performance. Some might call it a dance, but it's not random, it is choreographed. And of course, there's all this symbolic meaning. Their hats are supposed to be like tombstones, their robes are supposed to be like shrouds, and there is a saying of the Prophet, "Die before you die." Well, again, the mystical meaning is die to the ego, right? Transcend the ego. So that's the whirling dervishes. And by the way, and that's not what they call themselves. They call themselves Mevlevis, but outsiders call them whirling dervishes almost, facetiously, and then that name sort of stuck. But this also, notice that Mevlevi is the name of a Sufi order. So in later periods of Sufism, it became institutionalized, and these are three terms related to Sufism. One is dhikr, which means the remembrance of God. So all Muslims, the Quran says, remember God with a great remembrance, because the myth, if you will, of human existence is that we all recognized the divine. In a time before time, all the souls that would ever come into existence were asked by God, "Am I not your Lord?" And they all said, "Yes, you are." That's called the primordial covenant. So we already know. But we human beings come into the world and we forget. So remembrance is an important trope theologically, but it also becomes a ritual, a ceremony, a recitation of divine names and phrases, or it can become quite elaborate and include music or breathing, movements. That's dhikr. And then tariqa, it means a way, a path. So it also means a Sufi order. So you have great Sufis of the past who become initiators or founders of a particular practice. So the tariqa is both a path and a Sufi order. And then the sheikh. So the sheikh is the Sufi like a guru, a teacher, an initiator who is able to guide the student on the path. Okay? So popular Sufism, so this is a poster from South Asia, and it shows this idea of Sufi saints of the past and their shrines, and people make pilgrimages to their shrines. So that's how you could get 90% of the population involved in Sufism. They're not all doing, rigorous meditation and 40-day retreats, but they're visiting shrines and engaging in vowing behaviors. This is, some of you have been in Delhi, the shrine of Nizamuddin Auliya in New Delhi, the area called Hazrat Nizamuddin. So this shrine is visited by a range of people. And then something about Sufism, it's popular because you have female participation. So in some Muslim cultures, women are not that welcome in the mosques. But most of the shrines have a space where it can even be a family thing where you bring the children and they have a picnic and so on. So females participate. And this is actually a photo that I took in Egypt. So there's a shrine where I think one Tuesday a month females come, and there's kind of Sufi singing, there's an orchestra, and these women kind of cut loose and go into a trance dancing. So you see that cultural, both gender and culture, so we have gender, cultural, and history. That's why I've used RABI'A and RUMI to illustrate those points about gender and cultural influences. And now I'm going to go into the final phase of today's lecture, which I called Up to the New Age. So now we're in the contemporary period. Many scholars, nowadays Orientalist is kind of a negative word, but let's say late 20th century scholars of Sufism, maybe even anthropologists or others, maybe not so much more the textual scholars, would speak of a decline of Sufism in modernity. Part of it is that in modernity there's a disenchantment, as Max Weber said, right? So the miraculous and that aspect of Sufism gets more and more criticized by those who want to be modern and technological, like, why believe in this stuff? There's also a sense in which, we don't have the Rumis and the great poets of the past. Has Sufism become decadent? So that's the decline hypothesis. And in contrast to that, you have the adaptation hypothesis that Sufism has changed. It's not what it was 100 or 200 or 300 years ago. But let's look at modern urban environments, both in the Muslim world and in the West, and we can see Sufi elements, Sufi psychology, modern individualism. There are ways in which the openness of Sufism may meet the spiritual needs of the present. I'm also going to talk about Sufism in the West. Now, the New Age, of course, I don't want to get too stuck on that term. It can have a kind of negative valence, right? Like New Agey, loosey-goosey. I want to use it perhaps more positively in the sense of being open, again, adapting to meeting the spiritual needs of the present. So I wrote a paper once called In the Garden of American Sufi Movements, And I said there are these different flowers in the garden: perennials, hybrids, and transplants. So transplants are the Sufism that has come to Chicago, to America, to Europe, in the form of emigrant Sufis, Indo-Pakistani Turks and so on, who bring the Sufism the way they practiced back home, and they continue to practice in small groups with co-ethnics. Those are the transplants. But I'm going to talk about the perennials quickly. I see, maybe try to wrap up in 5 to 10 minutes. Groups that I call, among the perennials, 2 main groups: universalists and traditionalists. So among the universalist Sufis, one of the earliest and the most well-known and still influential until today is Sufi Inayat Khan, initially from India, Baroda, and had a murshid, had a Sufi teacher in Hyderabad. And his teacher sent him to America. He was a very accomplished musician, and he came to America to perform Hindustani music with an ensemble. But he says, I found that my American audiences, my Western audiences, they liked the music, but they were looking for something deeper. So he tried to bring them Sufi teachings, and he founded something called the Sufi order in the West. It's also known today as the Inayatiya, after his name, Inayat Khan, and it was then directed by his son Pir. Pir in Sufism, Pir means like a sheikh. It's a Persian word that means a venerable teacher. So Pir Vilayat Khan. And the teachings of Inayat Khan would be very resonant. It's like that same, it's not the Parliament of Religions of 1893, but it's in that same vein of the West coming to appreciate Eastern spirituality and also being interested in a variety of things: yoga, Buddhism, Sufism. That's why we call it universalist, one truth in different forms. And also, of course, there were movements like Theosophy that had become very popular among some Western spiritual seekers, and had an appreciation for the ancient wisdom of the East. So we can see the teachings of Inayat Khan, which are quite readily available, a lot of published works you can even read on the internet, embodying that sort of universalist message. It's a Sufi message, but it is an appreciation of all the teachers, all the prophets. Of course, the Islamic tradition says that 124,000 prophets have been sent to the world. Inayat Khan would consider the great names of Hinduism or Buddha or any great teacher, Kuan Yin in the Chinese tradition, all of them are embodiments of the truth. So this is the current leader of the Inayatiya, Zia Inayat Khan, who's based in the United States. So this is a form of Sufism, which I actually made these there. These are the different branches of the Inayatiya. So there's kind of the family line, there's a line through the brothers, and actually the little circles are supposed to be color-coded. Formal affiliation with the Islamic tradition is not required to be a Sufi in these lineages. So that's why I have the pink circles, but there are some green circles, like you can be a Muslim in this order, but it is certainly not necessary. Now, some of you may have heard of Sufi dancing. Actually, Sufi dancing in the Muslim world is not very common. I mean, there's the performance of the Mevlevis, there's some whirling in Iraq and Egypt, but it's not the usual main form. But in the West, there was a Sufi teacher in the Inayati lineage called Sufi Sam Lewis from San Francisco. And Sufi Sam Lewis developed with an American dancer, Ruth St. Dennis, developed a kind of system of Sufi dancing to which the participants would make movements a little bit like circle dancing or folk dancing, and they would chant phrases from different world religions like Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, or there is no God but God, or Kyrie eleison, this idea of universalist celebrating of the transmission of all the great religions. And this is just to maybe get even more a little new agey or maybe even pop culture, right? Because things come to the West and they get kind of, there's a whole field called the study of American religion. So American religion is metaphysical, it is therapeutic. Americans want their religion to do something for them. They want it to heal them physically, psychologically, and often it's commodified a little bit and it's popular. So there's something called the Golden Sufi Center, and its leader here, Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, is on the Oprah show talking about Sufism. And I actually listened to the YouTube of this, and at that point there's Islam is not part of the mix at all. It's, a spiritual path, pretty generic. Traditionalists are very interesting. This is a movement that we could call against the modern world. So, of course, there are some traditionalists, and a different kind of traditionalists in Christianity as well. But in the case of Sufi movements, René Guénon, Fridtjof Schoen, and the professor Said Hussein Nasser are well-known intellectuals who celebrate Sufism while they are critiquing modernity as the real problem. We have made humans, so against maybe the humanism, we have become too human-centered. We have moved away from the divine. So it's Sufism, but critiquing the loss of the sacred, if I can put it that way. And this is one of their lineages, and again, in the interest of time, perhaps I can whet your interest but not go further. So these are some of the Sufi themes of the perennials, and I already mentioned them. They're like American religion. And usually these groups are not particularly affiliated with the Muslim community. They won't go to the mosque and so on. Then there's the group I call the hybrids with the garden metaphor. There's been a number of Sufi movements in the United States that were brought by Muslim teachers. Bawa Muhyiddin was actually from Sri Lanka. Helveti Jirahis were from Turkey. Naqshbandi, Haqqanis, Turkey and Cyprus. So this is Bawa Muhyiddin, who was in Philadelphia, and he founded a mosque, and he's buried and has a shrine in Philadelphia. So Islamic, but also open to what we might call New Age spirituality. This is the head of the Naqshbandi Haqqani order, the late Sheikh Nazim, which again, I'm mapping out his different successors, and this became a global movement, but mainly in the West, but also appealed to, again, urban elites in some Muslim centers. And for this order, one has to be Muslim. So here you see, of course, religion on the internet. So you can watch their tapes, you can take initiation online, and you can even get merch, such as t-shirts, coffee mugs, and so on, with the picture of your spiritual leader on the shirt, right? So this is Sufism kind of in modernity. So these groups are active in the Muslim world. They may split into Muslim and non-Muslim branches. They may engage the Muslim community, but generally they have their own circles. So I guess I'm going to just finally indicate, which is maybe the furthest from our interests here tonight, but I would say that Sufi movements in the West, the kind of growth age of Sufi movements in the West since the 1990s has been what I call authenticity Sufism, which is Muslim youth, young people who have been born in the West, who want to get back to their roots, which are both Muslim and Sufi. So it's like being very interested in Islamic law, traditional knowledge, but wanting to go and sit at the feet of a teacher who is both a spiritual teacher but has that kind of Islamic authenticity or credibility, shall I say, whereas the kind of 1960s and 70s New Agey movements have somewhat not appealing so much to the younger cohort. So now maybe I'm getting a little bit sociological rather than necessarily talking about spirituality, but there's probably a spiritual takeaway as well. So that's my survey, and I see that I did bring us in with some time for questions, since you were very polite and didn't interrupt me along the way. So perhaps now, shall I field my own questions? I hope there are some questions, and I'd be happy to field them if you would like to ask. Yes, Nusrat. Oh, gotta wait for a minute? Oh, we're bringing a mic for you, so I guess you'll be on record with this. Okay, well, I guess you'll be next. Okay.
Yeah. Actually, I sometimes hear that early Sufism was influenced by the Upanishads of Hindus. Early Sufism, I hear, was influenced by the Upanishads of India and Hinduism. Is there a truth in it, or what? I don't know.
Okay, I'll try to handle, thank you for your very rich question. I'll repeat it if not everybody heard. The question was early Sufism perhaps influenced by the Upanishads? Because there have been some theory. So the early 20th scholarship on Sufism, often, in one way, it was characterized as kind of being troubled, like during the colonial period, often the colonial scholars, British and French scholars who encountered Sufi poetry, it was like they liked that poetry, but they weren't quite so sure about Islam. So they often sort of said, this stuff must come from somewhere else. Islam is a dry, legalistic tradition. How do you have this passionate, ecstatic, monistic kind of trend? So one strand in this scholarship was this is really influenced by Christianity. That there must have been engagement with the Christian kind of origins of Sufism. Even that Suf, the monks wore wool, and maybe they were influenced by the Desert Fathers. And then the connection to India was more around that figure of Al-Hallaj. So I'm glad I got to mention him, because remember he says, I am the truth, or I am God, I am the divinity, Bhagavan Soaham, right? That's sounds like a monism, and it's not completely off the table. So there are some have said, oh, he went to Sindh, and maybe he had a Hindu teacher there, and where he got those ideas. But, really there doesn't seem to be like a direct evidence. Does that make sense? Now, also Buddhism, for example, we know that there was a strong Buddhist presence in Afghanistan, right? Remember the Buddhas of Bamiyan, and even up to Iran, there was a Buddhist presence. So the kind of South Asian monistic traditions, Hinduism and Buddhism, did, after all, Islam kind of moves eastward, right? It starts in Arabia, and then the capital is Damascus, and then it's Baghdad. So by the time you get to Baghdad, there's kind of a Persian almost getting, it's more eclectic than, one might think. So take, for example, Buddhism. One of the Afghani kind of Central Asian Sufi orders, I actually mentioned them, the Naqshbandis. They have 8 Naqshbandi rules, like the Buddhist Eightfold Path. Now, of course, they're not the same as the Eightfold Path, but some of them are like, control your breath, be one-pointed, which sound a bit like the highest, right, stages on the Eightfold Path, the meditative. So there is no, as far as I know, real historical ability to connect those dots. It could be, remember, as I said, Islam has a monistic side to it, more so than either Christianity or Judaism. Does that monistic side come from the Quran itself, or does it come from that kind of looking eastward of the Islamic tradition? But certainly that all is one is part of the tradition. That's my answer. Nusrat, now you're going to get your turn, I think.
Thank you so much for this speech. It was great, a lot of really good information. A question is, before Muhammad got the realization, or when he got the message, he went to the mountains and he was just meditating. What was he exactly doing before Islam became a thing? You know, like how to pray and Quran was written. What exactly was he doing in the mountain, in the cave, before he received it?
Yeah, we're on the same page. I always thought it would be a great article to say the cave was called the Cave of Hira. You know, kind of like what was going on in the Cave of Hira, because it's rather mysterious. That Muhammad, who at that time was a successful merchant, it's said that he used to go periodically to this cave on a hill outside of the city and spend time there. Why was he spending time there? Who else was going to caves? Did he just spontaneously pick that up? So the Islamic tradition, of course, it's the question of what was Muhammad before the revelation is potentially sensitive. The Islamic tradition has a term for this called Hanif. You probably know that. Hanif can sometimes be translated as almost like instinctive monotheist, right? Because we know that the tribal religions of Arabia were actually more like nature religions. You know, stones, you know, so they worshipped idols. Well, it was more like they worshipped natural forces, much as like native people around the world. They were animists. They were sort of animists in that sort. And of course, from the perspective of the Islamic tradition, there's a story of Abraham, and Abraham worshipped the sun, and then the sun set, and he said, oh, I guess I don't want to worship something that goes away. I need the one God. So these, of course, we don't know what that Hanif idea is more theological. But the practice of going to cave, of course, fasting and those sort of practices were done by Christians. They were done by Jews in the environment. The going on retreats, we don't know. It could have been something that was existing in the environment because of course the Arabia had all of those layers of Near Eastern religion. So in some of those layers, there may have been a practice of retreat, but we do not have any direct in the Islamic tradition or in the Sufi tradition, data. Can I put it that way?
That was very enlightening. Thank you. Is there a tradition of vegetarianism in Sufism?
There's a tradition of almost everything in Sufism, including reincarnation. And vegetarianism is sort of like also celibacy, like all of those things are there, but they are not the mainstream. And so it's very interesting that when they are cultivated, they're kind of okay, right? Like it's okay that a Sufi didn't get married. It may even be sort of valorized, like God says to some people, hey, don't get married, for whatever reason. Different people. Well, I was going to tell a story, but maybe I better not. But the vegetarianism, I'm trying to think of there are definitely reports of some of the early Sufis who were vegetarian, and some of the people in the Inayatiyya, the Western Sufi orders, are also vegetarian, but I think you're asking about the early Sufis. And yet, in fact, there is a Sufi story that I remember, and it might even be about RABI'A, the female Sufi. I believe she encounters a male Sufi, and he sees that she's there, and like the animals are coming to her. You know, the birds are perching on her hand, and he says, you know, why do you have this rapport with these creatures? And she said, well, what did you eat today? And he said, well, I had some fried onions. And she said, well, what were they fried in? And it was something like, you know, they were fried in tallow, or they were fried in animal fat of some permitted kind. And then she says, well, that's why they won't come to you. So the implication is, you know, very much along the lines of vegetarianism as a purification.
What's the difference between main Islam and Sufism?
So the question was framed, what's the difference between like mainstream, or sometimes people use the word orthodox. Of course, you know, we scholars, we're always looking at words, we're not always, because orthodox means like everybody has the same belief. But scholars today, you know, using the English language, they say, you know, Islam is not so much orthodox. It's never like you have to say the creed, or, you know, what you believe is kind of what you believe. Of course, there's one God, this principle, but it's more orthoprax, you know, like praying, facing the direction of Mecca when you pray, eating halal food. It's kind of a big tent, you know, kind of a big tent religion. And in that sense, Sufism is Islamic. Sufis are Muslims, at least up until the New Age, you know. There had been, by the way, in the case of India, you probably know this, that some of the great, I showed you the shrine of Nizamuddin Auliya in Delhi, and he and some of the other Indian Sufis had Hindu disciples. So there was a kind of, if you will, golden age. Maybe it's romanticized a little bit, but in certain periods of Indian history, it shows the Sufi sages learning from the Hindu yogis, right? And vice versa. So there was a kind of eclectic universe, like it's all one truth, that had been in the Sufi tradition, especially in India. So it's not like, you know, some of the textbooks say, well, there's Sunni Islam, Shi'i Islam, and Sufi Islam. No, Sufism is not a sectarian identity. It's a personal orientation that somebody might pursue and become part of a Sufi order, but you can be a Sufi in Iran and be a Shi'i Sufi. You can be a Sufi somewhere else and be a Sunni Sufi. And now maybe in the New Age, you know, you can be a Sufi. So if you meet somebody and they say, I'm a Sufi but not a Muslim, I mean, nowadays, it's kind of possible if you're a Western-style Sufi for whom that criterion is there. But traditionally, Sufis would describe it like this. It's like, imagine a walnut, and the shell of the walnut, the structure, is the Sharia. It's like the mainstream Orthodox Islamic identity. You need that structure to hold it together. And then within that shell or structure, you have the meat of the nut, and that meat of the nut, the Sufis would say, is our Sufi order and method. It's our tariqah. So it actually kind of rhymes in Arabic. There's the Sharia, the tariqah, but if you press that meat of the nut and you get the essence or the pure oil, that is haqiqah. Haqiqah means truth. So you go from the outer to the inner. So the Sufi would not reject, not like, I'm not going to do my prayers anymore, I'm enlightened. It's like, I do my prayers, I do the external things, that's called dhahir, to get to the batin. And the divine is both the Dhahir and the Batin, both the Jalal and the Jamal. Jalal, power, like yin and yang and yin, you know, so there's, like, you would be out of balance to have the one, to want to get the oil without the nut or the meat of the nut, you know, that's going to be very hard. That's the challenge of contemporary spirituality. And the traditionalists would say that. They'd say, you know, if you think you can get it without some discipline, without some structure, it's very, very, you may get like a spontaneous, you know, in Zen, so we do comparative, you know, like mini Satori. You can get enlightenment. In fact, you could say we're already enlightened. The problem is, though, waking up to it, because you are enlightened, but even if you get that flash, you might get, you're washing your hands, and it's like washing your face in the morning, and you get a flash of enlightenment, but holding on to it without the structure. So even if you're looking from a spiritual perspective, the structure of the mainstream, you know, has a purpose to take you there. Correct. Thank you so much, Swamiji. Shukriya. Dhanyavad.
When Marcia was speaking, I was thinking that we are listening to Vedanta. And we'll be very happy that when I say, we are also Sufis, you know. Our guru, Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna, he took initiation from a Sufi saint and practiced Sufism 3 days very intensely. And then he declared all paths leading to the same goal. So this Sufism he also adopted, he practiced, and we have great respect for the Sufis. As you were mentioning about the Anal Haq, I am he, I am that, the same way we also say, Aham Brahmasmi. Aham, I, Brahmasmi. We call it Brahman. That is the almost same way. The practices that I was watching, that practice are the same. I have given you a book that we have published. At the end of it, you will find all the practices of different religions, almost the same. They're fasting, they're taking the name of Lord, then counting beads, visiting holy places, vigil. If all the practices are the same, the results are also supposed to be same. Results are also same, but we call it in very different names, that's all. But different type of names we have given. Allah, Jehovah, God, Ishwar, like that. Otherwise, it is all the same. But the basic thing, as you were telling again and again, and that is the main 4 pillars of the Sufism, first is love. L-O-V-E. The Swami Vivekananda said, what is God? L-O-V-E. Through love only you can reach God. We always say, each tradition, all philosophies, that God has created this universe. And if God has created, He has created everything. He has created Hindus, He has created Christians, He has created Muslims, He has created everyone. Then we are all that way related. We are brothers and sisters. How can we fight with each other? That is because of the ego, and that is our mistake. We have to overcome that ego, and we go to our Father. The Christianity, the end of Christianity is not heaven. It is that where the Jesus said, I and my Father are one. That is the end of Christianity. We should become one. Islam, the end of Islam, Anal Haq. I am that. The end of Hinduism, Aham Brahmasmi. I am that. So this unique thing, if we can understand. So we have started in our humble way, know and love. This is the series that we are inviting different scholars, and thank you for accepting our invitation and coming and speaking. I'm sorry, because the audience is very less, but whatever. When we come, we say, and it will be recorded and sent over all over the world, and thousands will be watching it. They will be knowing about it. So this is also the great thing. Thousands and thousands. You will afterwards will see. Here the people don't come because of the weather and this and that. Something is going on outside the world. But it doesn't matter. We are trying to reach out to people with this message that we are one and we are traveling to the same goal through different paths. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming again. Thank you very much.